Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And as I always say, if you're listening to us on whatever fine podcast platform you're finding us, you can also watch us on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts on the variety of podcast platforms that are out there. We ask that you leave a review. Let your friends know, let your family members know, let your friends' families members know, let your family's friends know, et cetera, et cetera. Joining me today, I'm very excited about this. His name is Javed Ali. He's an associate professor of practice at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He brings more than 20 years of professional experience in national security and intelligence issues in Washington, D.C. He's held positions with the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Homeland Security, before joining the Federal Bureau of Investigation. While at the FBI, he also held senior roles on joint duty assignments at the National Intelligence Council, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the National Security Council under the Trump administration. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Michigan, a JD from the University of Detroit School of Law, and an MA in international relations from right here in our backyard, American University. He writes and provides commentary across a number of media sites and platforms, including MSNBC, CBS, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, and Newsweek. Javed, thank you so very much for joining us today. And let's start here. As we are speaking, we've had this case break. We had a story break a little over a week ago about intelligence documents related to the war between Russia and Ukraine leaked on social media, leaked out there. We now know that or at least they're alleging, that the person who leaked these documents is a 21-year-old airman named Jack Teixeira, who's with the Massachusetts Air National Guard. What do you make of this situation? I've talked to folks and they say this is a failure of the higher ups at the base. This is a failure of why did this kid get access to these documents? Walk us through what you think about this and where things are.
Well, first, Andrew, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really excited to be with you this afternoon. And geez, there's just so much to unpack, even
right
on the sort of the leaks front. So let me start with some of the perspectives I've shared with the media over the past week or so. One of these sort of issues that seems to be coming up is that, and you already referenced it, is why would someone that young in the position that they had have access to those very sensitive materials? And the response that I've given in all these different media interviews is that it's less about the age and more about the access and placement that Teixeira had. He could have been a middle-aged person like myself and theoretically done the same thing inside the Beltway. So the age in and of itself isn't the red flag here, but it's more the fact that he had a top secret SCI clearance, or appears to have had one, had access to a facility, in this case a military base, in which that access was, that provided his clearance, gave him the access to a secure facility, which is known as a SCIF, inside the base. And then he, the sort of third prong here, which created the vulnerability or created the leak, is that not only did he check those first two blocks, again, irrespective of age, but then he had access to this very controlled computer system that only resides in these SCIF facilities, and you have to have the right clearance in order to access the computer in which all this very sensitive intelligence resides. And so that is how Teixeira managed to pull this off. And it's a pretty remarkable story when you think about it, and it's so brazen. But what I consider, or what I thought about when I was in government, and now that I've been out for the last few years, that system that I just described is pretty fragile. And the reason why most people don't commit those crimes or engage in that activity is because it's illegal. There's this perception that you're being watched anyways. And most people who show up to do work in these jobs, and I would put myself in that category when I was doing it, you're there for the right reasons, right? You're there to serve the country. You're there to help keep the country safe. These are important kind of roles, and we're entrusted with this really sensitive information, and that's why 99.99% of the people you don't have to worry about. But all that said, again, one person managed to expose the fragility of this system that I was talking about. And now I think there needs to be a serious relook at sort of this enterprise-wide level of security to prevent the next time this potentially could happen.
Right, and okay. Let's get into what was revealed, because I do want to talk about the war at year one. The war. Was there anything truly damaging in what was revealed? Anything that sort of belies what we have understood what was going on in Central Europe? I want to get a sense as to besides the fact that the act itself is damaging to the United States, it's damaging to our credibility, it's damaging to the intelligence community, but the actual information that was released, how does that sort of impact ongoing operations, U.S. foreign policy, et cetera?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know from the outside because we don't, or certainly I don't know, the full scope of what was disclosed by Teixeira and uploaded in a Discord and then shared on social media. But even the secondhand media reporting that I've been following suggests that there have been some strategic level perspectives on different issues in different regions of the world, and that may not be the totality, again, of what was disclosed. But even what the media has reported, I don't think there's anything that folks probably didn't already know already, or you couldn't have picked up those insights from just paying attention to the news. And so I'm not minimizing the extent of the damage that the leaks potentially have resulted in or could result in, but I don't think they were as damaging to operations, or again, my perception is ongoing operations or really sensitive collection methods, sources, because again, if he was only taking out these slides that are put together every day through this joint staff intelligence briefing, and when I started my job at the Defense Intelligence 20 years ago, I actually was part of that machine that was producing those daily slides. Again, in these controlled environments, very, very sensitive. But though even if disclosed, it's not going to lead to grave harm, thankfully. So I think the damage, as far as we know, should be pretty limited. I also don't think it's going to cause too much consternation at the diplomatic level. And that's why, again, I sort of default back to this notion. This is the most significant damage, I think, is internally in the intelligence community. How did this happen? Why did it happen? And how do we prevent it again? Versus what was disclosed, and how potentially that could alter the course of the fight between Russia and Ukraine or other issues.
Right. We get down to it, and as I understand it, Teixeira was trying to do this. This is the danger that a lot of us get into, is arguing with somebody online, and people think that they are experts. From what I understand, this kid was just trying to. He was trying to say, I know more than you do, and here's what I know. Are you understanding it in that way as well?
I mean, that's my perception as well, based on the media reporting. And unfortunately, when most people get into these online tiffs or these virtual communities in which they exist, you generally just are sharing links to other news stories or other, wherever you get your information from. You're not usually getting classified slides from the joint, the J2 brief, to validate this perception that you actually do more than the people that are part of that community, big or small. And so that's what made this different. But he doesn't seem to have the same motivation or intent that Chelsea Manning did, or a Reality Winner, or Edward Snowden, the people who've been responsible for these, what I would argue, more damaging leaks over the past decade plus.
Right. It's the twin edges of, are you a whistleblower, or are you someone who is out there to really fundamentally damage and compromise United States foreign policy and international relations, et cetera. I was going to make a joke that, as a general rule, maybe if you are part of a Discord server and you're engaging in this, maybe you don't get to have a better than top secret clearance. I don't know.
Part of some of these reforms I've contemplated about, the intelligence community needs to take community needs to take a step back and sort of reevaluate how people, maintain clearances or get reinvestigated once you have a clearance. And I wrote an op-ed about this that landed in the Cipher Brief platform, if any of your listeners or viewers are familiar with it. But in that sort of this plan that I laid out, part of it is maybe now for people who have top secret SCI clearances, you actually have to engage in some level of mandatory reporting of your social media activity because there's no way for the intelligence community to know that on its own. And so this would put the onus on people who have the clearances to declare, here are the accounts I have, or here are the platforms I'm in. And that may deter this type of activity in the future.
Do you think there's a generational thing at work? Because I've known folks in the IC over the years, and they have very limited social media. If they do, sometimes it's under a pseudonym, so there's no connection with their professional life. Is it a generational thing now? I mean, and I suppose it is, because if this kid Tashir is 21, he's raised in the age of social media. I go back. I mean, I realized I've been on Facebook, and I shake my head at this, probably for 14 years. So since this kid was 7, so he's been raised in this era. There's a generational component, is what I'm saying here.
I mean, there might be, but there are lots of folks who either former intelligence community professionals, or perhaps even ones that are in, that also have social media accounts. So you can't just say, well, it's only this much younger generation that will only engage in social media activity. I think it's a question of responsibility in social media.
God, I'm sorry, because I did fall back, and you made it really clear this really isn't about an age issue, because this could literally happen to anybody if they're sort of engaged in these things. So let's talk about this, because I was like you. I read through the reports of what was in this documentation, and I obviously have been following what's been happening in Central Europe. Very concerned. I've dabbled back in this over the years and writing some things about Russia and Russia versus Ukraine, going back to some pieces that I wrote back in 2014 even. And to me, there wasn't anything surprising here. As I mentioned to you before we came on, I had a conversation about a month ago with Paul Post from the University of Chicago about his impressions of the way things are going, where things are 1 year into this conflict. Where are you in all this? Where do you think things stand at 1 year plus into this conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, like any conflict, nothing ever goes according to plan, either on the aggressor side or, the defender side. And I think that's what we've seen over the past year. Whatever Putin thought this campaign, or what, he still calls the special military operation, was going to achieve, I have a hard time believing that into a year or more than a year into this operation, this campaign, that this is successful. Because in my perspective, at every sort of strand of this campaign, that it doesn't look good if you're sitting back in Moscow. I mean, the human toll for the Russian military is staggering. I don't think anybody knows what the true number is, but even the U.S. and the British military have said it's probably over 200,000 casualties in less than a year. I mean, that is a World War I type of loss, and it's hard to wrap your head around that in terms of the destruction to the Russian military. And beyond the manpower, it's the equipment and the materiel and all the things that they have just kind of thrown into this ferocious type of combat in Ukraine. So that's surprising. I wrote an op-ed at the beginning of the campaign, going back a year, and said that if you compare what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s with the Soviet occupation, and again, that campaign went in a completely different direction than I think, the Politburo then thought, that, over time, the Soviets suffered about 10,000 casualties in about a decade. And that is basically what ultimately led to the withdrawal of the Soviet military from Afghanistan. They thought in that period of time that 10,000 was just too much of a cost to bear. And again, they had wound up occupying the country. That probably wasn't the plan either. And the longer they stayed, the more unpopular they got. Russia has, if the numbers are accurate or even conservatively accurate, multiplied that amount of manpower losses by 20 in a year, right? So just the math is completely different. And And at the same time, diplomatically, they are more isolated. Economically, there's, significant impact to the Russian economy, although it looks like they're able to withstand some of that. But nobody knows where this is going to end and when it's going to end and what victory looks like for Putin or even on the Ukrainian side. I mean, these are all really tough questions that I don't think anybody has the answer to.
But it's a situation in which, right, Russia is playing the waiting game. I mean, Russia, as long as Russia can sell oil on the market and Russia has buyers for their oil, they can fund the war machine, and therefore they can continue to throw, troops and mercenaries and technology at the problem in the hopes, right, that either A, and probably a combination of the two, either A, Ukraine and the Ukrainians get disheartened and they're done, or B, that he can sort of turn specifically, not just the West, but specifically the United States, away from continuing to send weapons and training over there. It's really a matter of time. And actually, let me get your answer on that first. That they're content to play this waiting game because they want Ukraine. They were trying to take Ukraine whole. Now what they really want is Eastern Ukraine, and they want to maintain hold of Crimea. And as long as they do that, that's victory for them, isn't it?
I mean, that certainly seems like a plausible scenario for Putin because he's got to be able to go back to the population of Russia, which have suffered so greatly because of, again, the losses to this generation of Russian men, even in a year, that it was worth something, right? And it has to be worth something tangible and physical. And yes, Russia is a bigger country. It has 4 to 5 times the population of Ukraine. I also think there's something culturally to the Russian mindset where in their history, they have suffered even greater calamities and losses in the name of, the motherland or, the Russian Federation. So I think Putin is playing on that sense of Russian history too, that, that the country is willing to engage in these kind of hardships and this kind of suffering to its own people to achieve its objectives. But the reality is it's coming at a terrible cost inside Russia. And how long can Putin withstand this before things become so unpopular, like they were in Afghanistan, where he's either forced out, some new generation of leaders come in, or the Russian military literally just breaks, and we don't know the answer to that either.
Well, and that's I guess the question, and this is a question that I asked Paul Post a while back, right? There's no incentive right now for either side to come to the table. And listen, I'm someone who believes, I want to be really clear about this, Russia is in the wrong. All of the histrionics about NATO aside, because you go back and you peel through the accusations against NATO and NATO predation on the Russian borders. To me, it's hogwash.
Although ironically, NATO is now bigger a year into the fight than when Putin started. So
yes. So my point is that Russia is in the wrong, but there's nothing that sort of gets either side to the table here. We're giving Ukraine the weapons that they need to fight this fight. They're using them to great effect, and we could talk about the Easter or the spring offensive if you want, counteroffensive. And Russia can just sort of throw things at it. What brings them to the table, if anything? I mean, am I right that nothing's bringing them to the table right now? But what ultimately does bring them to the table?
Yeah, I think we're at a stalemate right now, and there's because of that stalemate, it's just this daily grind of combat where you just have human suffering and physical destruction on, both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. If a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive happens, and I'm not, the military expert here, but if that were to happen, is that something that would make Putin eventually sort of relent and sue for peace? But again, he has to walk away with something tangible outside of, all the Russian elements, whether, paramilitary or regular forces, getting pushed out of Eastern Ukraine. I think he's lost the case on NATO. I mean, NATO is not only expanded already, it's probably going to further expand. It wouldn't surprise me if Zelensky makes the bid to have, Ukraine be the next country that gets NATO membership, because he's got nothing to lose at this point. Russia's already NATO. So
you raise an interesting point, right? Because it's the idea of under NATO rules, you can't join if your territorial borders are in dispute. But if he gets the international community to buy in and recognize, something, this is our sovereign territory. But then again, right, isn't there the downside that if Ukraine joins NATO, NATO's obligated to get involved. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no NATO country is going to accept Ukrainians, bid now, because that would pull NATO into the fight. But eventually, again, if there can be some kind of resolution to this current conflict, I would have to believe that whoever the Ukrainian president is at some point, that they would make that case. Another one of these wild card scenarios that I don't hear a lot of people talking about is, again, Russia's been able to withstand these military losses just because of just Russian identity and history and, just the sheer size of the country. But Russia has also been able to hold the line, so to speak, because they've made these transactional relationships that may become more enduring and strategic with China, with Iran, with North Korea. And so while NATO has expanded under the framework of this conflict, this is the downside, I think, of the conflict, is that Russia has moved even closer to the other countries that the U.S. and the West consider, certainly the U.S. considers, adversaries. And that's probably not something that people thought was going to happen when this conflict started a year ago.
Let me throw a wild card in here, wild card question, and you can say, something, I'm not familiar with it, so I don't want to answer. Feel free to say that. So my colleagues at William & Mary's Global Research Institute have a piece up. They do their annual survey of professors of international relations, ranking the greatest threats that they see on the world. They say that this survey says that according to the international relations professorial body around America, that climate change is the greatest threat facing the world. China is second. Russia is like fifth or sixth. This seems awfully out of touch with the reality of what's happening in this world. Want to get your thoughts on this?
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on climate change, but I do think that as the National Security Threat Board has evolved over the past 20 years, and when I was in government, we were hyper-focused, and I say we, the U.S. government, we were hyper-focused on counterterrorism because we had to, first with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, several years later. But in that span of time, these other really prominent national security issues started to emerge as well. The sort of the challenges from Russia and China, climate change, COVID by 2020. So now, if you look at the national security priorities of the U.S., yes, they are very different from my time in government, where we had almost the luxury of focusing on one problem and trying to go really deep on that one problem. This has got to be hard for the Biden administration, and their national security strategy from last year is a reflection of this much more diverse national security landscape, where counterterrorism is barely mentioned in that fact. It's mentioned, but it is not the prominent feature of it. And if you were to compare the national security strategies of the Bush, Obama, and even the Trump administration, and I was there from 2017 to 2018, counterterrorism, if it wasn't number one, it was in the top, 3. And now even counterterrorism is definitely, probably at the bottom end of 10. And all these other ones are competing for, the top 3. And so it's hard. Like, is climate change number one now? It might be. Is China number one now? China, I think the Biden administration has been more hawkish on China than even the Trump administration was. So, things are moving faster and more rapidly in the national security landscape from 2018, from when I left government, from when I was in, from 2002 to 2018.
By the way, I'm convinced my dad is on a list somewhere, because he could not remember with his iPhone that he would say that her name was Siri. So he kept calling her ISIS. And so you got my dad say, "Hello, ISIS, play this song for me." And I'm convinced, as I said, my dad's on a list. Right. Listen, because we're talking about counterterrorism, you've got a really interesting piece, and I got to ask you about this. This idea of designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations. Talk a little bit about that. I think it's a fascinating way of looking at the problem.
Yeah, it's something that I think even in my own mind, it's taken me a while to kind of get to this place where I am now intellectually. And when I was in government, this was a fairly controversial issue as well, because we were dealing with so many of the traditional and classic terrorist groups. Then this notion of, oh, geez, now we got to put drug cartels into that mix, and how do we reapportion our limited resources to go against the Al-Qaedas and ISIS's and Lebanese Hezbollahs of the world and perhaps tackle the Mexican drug cartels too. But again, because the international terrorism threat it's not eliminated, and it's certainly not zero, but it is not as prominent as it was when I was in government. Perhaps now this is like the moment in time to sort of reconceptualize what counterterrorism looks like. And if we're looking for additional tools to put pressure on drug cartels, which we all can agree are causing tremendous harm to our national security, both inside the U.S. and certainly Mexico. It doesn't seem like the Mexican government has fully ramped up to confront that threat on its own soil. To me, this would be a really interesting conversation about using the authorities that the Secretary of State has, coming up with a designations package for one of the 9 cartels, if not all of them. I think Lindsey Graham has said we should just designate all of them. And then seeing what effect, if any, it would have on their, these cartels' operations on both sides of the border. But to me, the red line that was crossed was the murder of the 2 Americans. I think it was in late February now. And whether that was deliberate or not, that to me is something that should be met with a forceful response. And I'm not suggesting, military operations. I'm just saying, use this tool that we haven't used before against cartels, and it would put financial pressure on them. It would open up more investigative and law enforcement authorities, and it could also have some benefit on the intelligence side. So I think now might be the time to be more serious about this, because if we want to confront this drug threat, why not use the a tool that we have?
Listen, and not to say that this was lifted from Tom Clancy's Clear and Present Danger, but I appreciate this. It's the issue of we have to be thinking more creatively about how to deal with these problems. And if the old ways don't work, or if there are ways that we haven't tried that might work, maybe we ought to go about trying them. This is essentially what you're saying, isn't it?
Right, because status quo is not working, right? The drugs are still flowing into the United States. Again, we're not, we're limited in our ability to stop that flow. And the Mexican government, likewise, hasn't been able to shut things down on their side of the border. So even with the designations, it's not like this would be the panacea to the problem, right? It would not completely, eliminate the threat that these cartels present. But again, it just gives the U.S. government another tool to apply in addition to the existing tools. And I think it also, there's a labeling effect here. If a Mexican drug cartel, which I think they are in the business of selling their products for financial gain, if you start describing them as terrorist organizations, that's bad for business. And that might get them to change their behavior as well. So now that might be a little too optimistic on my end, but I do think from a labeling perspective, there's value in that too.
What I appreciate about this, and you can tell me that I'm totally off base here. When I was teaching, one of the emphasis was on practicality and teaching students about sort of how public policy really works, so to get them prepared for real world careers in public policy. What I appreciate what you're talking about here is you're taking your practical experience, being in the IC for as long as you were, now you're in academia teaching about it, and you're using that experience to think creatively about solving problems. I mean, do you think that, it's not that you're going to say that it necessarily puts you at an advantage, but it makes you a very different theoretist in the academic world. Am I wrong there?
Well, I mean, the fact that I'm even teaching is what I jokingly call the 1 in a million bank shot, because I did not have the traditional credentials that most serious academics do. I didn't have a PhD, but even beyond that, I mean, my government career was spent sort of not with any sort of public facing role. So even when I sort of poked my head up and was being evaluated by the University of Michigan, which is my alma mater as well, as a candidate to come in and teach, I'm not even sure they really even knew who I was, because again, there was no record of me, prior to 2002. So that, that was hard for me to be taken seriously initially, and then just learned the art of teaching, which also was not something that I had a track record in.
So I'm going to just say, because I know for me, when I stepped foot on my alma mater's campus to teach for the first time, it was a heady experience for me. What's that like, stepping onto the campus of the University of Michigan and going and working as a faculty member?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. To me, it's sort of the dream job. So if my first sort of dream job was this very unusual career that I had in government, and you described, all these different organizations that I worked in, and all these different roles that I had, and I, felt so privileged and honored to do that for as long as I did. I feel the same way about teaching at Michigan because, again, I thought I was a very unconventional candidate. You just don't roll up to any school, certainly not the University of Michigan, and say, "Hey, I want to teach," without having ever taught before, right? And not having the sort of the union card of the PhD to get in, or no track record of research or publication. So it's I've been doing this now for 5 years. I truly enjoy it. I feel as passionate about teaching as I did about my government service, and to me, it's just another way of giving back to this younger generation. And yeah, I approach the issues that we've been talking about, and I examine in my classes from the lens of a practitioner. I can't sit there and talk about sort of the academic theory or my own sort of research that has driven me to these perspectives because I just don't have that. But what I do have, I think, is that government experience. But I'm not in the classroom just telling war stories. I mean, I do. Sure. There is a intellectual framework behind everything that I do. But yeah, that just makes me a little different. But again, very humbled, very honored, and
I get it.
It's great to be back home and to be back at the alma mater.
Let's talk again, getting back into these sort of the creative ways at looking at solving problems. You have a recent piece up about classifying or designating schools, public schools, as critical infrastructure. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was another one of these 3 a.m. ideas that I have, and that's usually where my op-eds come into play. I mean, something happens, usually not that doesn't, it's a crisis or some awful event, and then I think, okay, geez, what else could we do as a country or within the government that could potentially have an impact on this problem and prevent it from happening again or deter it. So thinking about, mass shootings in the U.S., I mean, terrible, phenomena that's been going on for years now. We don't seem to be making much progress on this. Every day you pick up the headlines and there's a mass shooting somewhere. But when it comes to schools, I mean, that's something I think we can all agree is, educators, as parents, as members of communities, like we need to keep our kids safe. And so this whole issue of critical infrastructure in the U.S., this has been a evolving process, both before 9/11 and now after 9/11. But I don't think we've ever really thought about sort of K through 12 schools as part of critical infrastructure the same way we think about the telecommunications sector and water and nuclear energy and power and gas and everything that seems to fit that classic conception of critical infrastructure. But it sounds cliche, but children are an incredibly precious resource. I have a son who's a junior high school, and I teach at a big college, right? So I understand the importance of protecting this these younger generations. And so interestingly, the Secretary of Homeland Security has the authority to designate different sectors in the United States as critical infrastructure. Now, again, even with a pen stroke, there would have to be a lot that would need to be accomplished from an implementation perspective. But still, this might be something that DHS, under one of the subcomponents now of DHS, known as CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that is responsible for the federal role in critical infrastructure protection. Is this something that CISA could think hard about going down the road? I would argue we should at least think about it. And again, whether Secretary Mayorkas wants to do this, that would be really interesting. But I think there's a lot that can be done when it comes to hardening schools from the threat of these mass shootings. And if there's going to be any focal point for that in the federal government, it would be CISA through DHS.
What I appreciate is that you think about, yes, I understand the concept of the 3 a.m. bit of inspiration that happens to me as well. But, then taking it and turning it and thinking more deeply about it, listen, I'm going to say, a Secretary of Homeland Security, Javed Ali, down the road would, not that you would want to necessarily leave Michigan, but anyway, I want to turn to something a little bit more fun. FBI comes out and says, don't use public chargers. Now, I am someone who I don't use public chargers. I have a charger with me when I travel. I I used to be the guy, Javed, I swear to God, I hated giving up a cell phone that did not have a removable battery, because I would be the guy who would have, 3 batteries with me or 2 extra batteries with me at any given time, and I'd swap them out and I'd just be charging them at night. But the FBI warns about this. You don't focus so much on the warning itself. We could talk about that, but you focus on what this says about the FBI. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting piece. And what I thought was interesting about that is that bulletin, I think, for lack of a better word, that came out wasn't from big FBI, which is normally these sort of security warnings or bulletins about vulnerabilities or threats come out usually from sort of like the corporate FBI, right? The Washington, D.C. headquarters FBI. And my position at FBI was in headquarters, not even at the Washington field office. But this one came out from FBI Denver. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So why did FBI Denver put out this warning about this perceived vulnerability with, airport charging stations or other, public charging stations or devices? And why didn't it come from big FBI or FBI cyber division or criminal division or any, the big sort of the gears that move inside of FBI headquarters? I don't have an answer to that, but I did think it was interesting that this came from FBI Denver. And again, spoke to this potential vulnerability that's out there. And this is now of one of just several cyber related vulnerabilities you got to think about when you're operating in the public world.
It was a couple of years ago that folks were talking about, oh, hey, isn't it cool? People are embedding USB thumb drives into walls and you should go and check them out and plug them. I'm like, no. Anyway, the same way you don't put anything else that's vulnerable, any vulnerable appendage into some strange hole somewhere, you don't do that as well. So listen, before we let you go, and you've been very generous with your time, I do ask my guests about their outside interests, because I think it's important for folks to know that policy folks aren't just all about policy. Lawyers aren't just about the law. Politicians just aren't all about politics. So when you're not teaching, you mentioned you have a son in junior high school, you're at Michigan, you mentioned before we came on, you mentioned that football team that's up there. What are you doing when you're not teaching, when you're not writing? What are you up to?
Yeah, I mean, I had serious jobs in government, and I think I've got a serious one now, but I don't take myself that seriously, and I have lots of outside interests. Certainly big sports fan, and so again, part of the dream of coming back to Michigan, to the state of Michigan, is teaching at my alma mater and being back embedded with the school that I'm so passionate about the teams here, and the teams have been very successful. Even since I moved back from Washington, D.C. So that's certainly something that I enjoy a lot. Watching my high school son sort of grow up, both in D.C. and now back here in Michigan, that's been great too. Both my family and my wife's family are from the Detroit area, and that was
nice.
Another sort of piece of the puzzle that was important to us as we contemplated, leaving these successful careers we had in Washington and coming back to Michigan. So it's nice to be around family again.
All right, I got to ask you, which is better? And there's a right answer here. Actually, there's no right answer. Ben's Chili Bowl or the Coney Dogs of Detroit?
Ooh, that is a tough one. But again, I'm going to show my Detroit roots here. I'm going to go with, the Coney Island dogs and anything really Coney Island related. Not to say anything negative about Ben's Chili Bowl, no. But if you're a Michigander or Detroiter, the sort of whole Coney Island, series of restaurants here, it's just an institution. So the next time you're here, Andrew, we'll have to take you to one. So
absolutely, I look forward to it. Well, Javed Ali, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Absolutely, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me.
And this has been another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal News Wire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.